Alright, me. It is decently early on in May, and I just finished reading Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. Um, this book was initially read for a class that I had taken before I started this project, which was American literature, basically modernism and then postmodernism. Um, so this will be added to that playlist, but the playlist is going to be a lot of out of order because this was decently late into that class that we read this book. But that's that. Book itself is really interesting because it is a long series of short stories written by Bradbury, not necessarily for this book. A lot of it is was written for other pieces, or short stories that were written for other publications that were then compounded into the Martian Chronicles, as I remember correctly. So there's, some little bits of contradiction in kind of like the way things are kind of envisioned. But that's just because some of these stories are published in one place for one specific reason, and some of these stories are published somewhere else, and those continuities don't necessarily line up. But yeah, really the interesting thing and the fun thing about science fiction to me is that it is such a weird way to go about doing a lot of criticism about the world and looking at kind of the faults in which what the world kind of relies on, or as a snapshot of that point. And for whatever reason, it gets kind of overlooked. Like that idea of what science fiction is doing sometimes gets really overlooked. But really, that's like science fiction is like the greatest kind of idea of, let's take all of the faults in the world and make them shine and make them the most important thing in the world. But then we can put it in a future setting, or in a setting like Mars, or say that someone else is doing it, some other alien planet is doing it, right? And in all those cases, somehow, because there's a distance between us as the reader and our world and what the world is in science fiction, we can look at it and point out the flaws in it without necessarily sometimes looking back and going, oh, that's actually bringing about a point in our world. So yeah, science fiction is really interesting in that sort of way. There's a few kind of interesting things here. Environmentalism really stands out to me a lot. When we're talking about the portions in this which are featured on Earth do a lot of talking about the environmental issues that are actually caused by the rockets. The change, like it's a forced change of seasons in some cases, in which the heat and the propulsion that is caused by the amount of rockets that are leaving is actually turning your autumns into springs because of how much it is heating the planet. And things like that, right? Which certainly is another one of these things in which, we look at this from a very outside perspective and go, well, that's unrealistic. We would never launch so many rockets that we change our climate. And then we proceed to do exactly that, except instead of rockets, it's other things, it's factories and whatnot, right? So there's a lot of that. A lot of, as to be expected, I think, with thinking about Mars, is a lot of colonization issues and colonialism, when we look at like the first three expeditions that are shown in this, what we really constantly see is, as the explorers, we are expected to somehow show that we are the greatest, and everyone's supposed to worship us or be proud that we've traveled and that we've conquered something, without ever really thinking about, well, what does this actually mean for the people that are already here, the beings that are already here. And the first expedition, which is kind of like a jealous rage type deal, but it's still kind of in a similar fashion of, we don't necessarily understand the situations that are going on in the world that we are entering into, right? Expedition 2, which one was Expedition 2? I think number 2 was I was forgetting which number 2 and which number 3 is. Number 2, I believe, was the one in which they come down and they're sent from place to place to place to place, and eventually sent into an asylum. Right, and that's just one of those things in which, because of how concrete and real we think of our own traveling is, we don't necessarily understand what that impact is for others, right? And so, in this world, we don't understand that there's a history of people that claim to be from different places, right, that are not Mars, but then also that Martians have this ability to, when they communicate telepathically, they can also manifest ideas that already exist, or manifest kind of their own machinations and creations. But because we don't understand that, we don't understand how their world works, we just expect to be rewarded for traveling. And instead of trying to figure out their culture, we just immediately assume that we are the greatest, right? And then the third one, which I believe is the one in which they land and the entire town is set to be kind of this America 1920s type town, right? And it's just an interesting idea of, well, what happens when your greatest desire is used against you, right? So all kind of interesting things, but also just a lot of talks about, colonialism and the effects of it, and not fully understanding what the effects of it are until you take a step back and look at it from a different perspective. And then also, certainly, the way in which the Martians are described as dying, right? In which the Martians die from what is effectively a childhood disease, right? And they're wiped out by chickenpox, in the same way that large portions of North America were wiped out by smallpox, right? And South America, North America, South America, and the indigenous peoples that lived in these areas, wiped out by smallpox, which at the time was not something that really mattered to European countries, right? It's just another one of those things in which there's a huge amount of unintended consequences to what we do, right? Especially when it comes to working with others and like traveling, and then eventually colonialism and colonization, right? And there's still effects that, even to this point, are not fully understood or refuse to be understood by certain people. That's that. Let's see other. I remember the first time that I read this, the portions that really struck me, that I really remembered vividly, were, there's a chapter that's called like the naming of names, and I think it's just me, and then a few chapters later where they kind of talked about the same thing. But it's kind of a concept in which the way that we name things, certainly we can never understand the history of the things that we as people who have colonized an area know them to be as, right? We can translate them, that doesn't necessarily mean and get the concepts and the history that are involved with a name, right? But then also, Europeans have a wonderful tendency to do this, in which we give the most boring ass names to things. And instead of creating new ways of thinking about things and adopting and using the natural features and things, we go, well, what does this town produce? What are we looking at this town to produce? So we have Electric City and Mineville and New York, right? And instead of creating a new world and new ideas and things like that, we just resort to what has already been established, right? Or the immediate first thing that comes to mind. And in doing so, we create a world that is hyper sanitized, and a world that just simply doesn't, like, let's just phrase this, a world that simply just doesn't care about nature and beauty and things, and so we only care about what can be produced, which is another big concept throughout the Martian Chronicles, is being very anti-capitalist in the sense that all the characters that we see that are kind of this capitalist type or are exploiting capitalism in some way, those are characters that tend to be seen as kind of the bad characters in the short stories, versus the characters that are a little more free-willed and don't necessarily care about possessions as much. Those are the characters that tend to be shown as good, positive characters throughout the stories. Yeah, and then I guess the final kind of thing to touch on off the top of my head is, just lots of talks about the loneliness of things. Especially at the end of this novel, or at the end of the short stories, which are after the Earth has started its atomic war, and we're looking at kind of the last few people that are on Earth or on Mars, and what we see is this intense loneliness that exists as part of humanity, right? Humans are a very social creature, but sometimes we forget that because we get into this habit of thinking that we are so different that we need to be separated, or that that our work is more important than the people that we're around, and then we lose the sense of kind of the social construct of what it means to be human. And then eventually, when there are no more humans, well, all of a sudden we're intensely lonely, and we go to extreme lengths to fight it. But even then, we're looking at things in which even in extreme loneliness, we still have certain standards that we expect others to live up to, even if we do not live up to those standards ourselves, right? Yeah. Other thing to mention, off the top of my head, is a lot of this, especially towards the end again, focuses on kind of this automation and about how the world will continue on without humans. Mars will continue on without Martians, things like that. One of the very last stories is basically the envisionment of a house that is super automated. I don't remember I don't remember if it says that it's on Mars or if it's on Earth, but whichever one it's on, right? Um, the house has been abandoned for 15 years at this point. If it's on Mars, it's been abandoned for 20 years. And the house is still going. It's still, it's still, doing the thing it's been automated to do. Um, and just sweeping up everything and not necessarily caring about what it's actually doing or if it's wasting something, right? Doesn't necessarily stop to ever consider that what it's doing might be wasteful, right? And there's a poem that's included in there, which the story is named after, which refers to the idea that nature will continue without, when the last human dies, nature will continue on and nothing will really change. But really, in this context, it's used to also insinuate this, that not only will nature not care, but also the things that we've created will not care. The pure amount of automation that goes into the world will not care once there is no more humans to exist. It will continue to go on because it doesn't know how to do anything else. Which is a really, it's in some ways it's a terrifying idea, right? That we are so dependent as humans on things that will continue to happen without us ever being here, both in nature, but then also in the things that we've created in automation. I think it also goes to show that as, we are further and furthering our ability to use AI to complete things, that these are things that don't care about who we are or what we're trying to accomplish, right? All it does is spit out an answer or an idea, right? It doesn't necessarily ever consider about the human factor that exists, right? And for some people, certainly, I guess that's a positive thing. But in my personal opinion of all of this, right, it's you're missing out on a lot of these human connection, human emotion factors that fall into, and human critical thinking that falls into, a lot of these minor everyday things. But because there's a machine, there's an AI that will just do it for you and save you time. Well, then let's just use that, I guess. But yeah, that is. Anything else? No. That is the Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. For whatever reason, I can never get his name on the first try. Yeah, I think it's a really, really fun read. I think it's a really interesting read. Yeah. I mean, this is the first in a couple books for this class that I'm reading out of order now that since I'm no longer in that class. But yeah.